everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Dr. Elizabeth Norton, and we're going to be talking about Henry's third wife and the wife that is considered to be his true love, Jane Seymour. How are you today, Elizabeth?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me back on. It's an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk about the six wives, especially Jane, because as you have discussed previously, she's kind of overlooked a lot in terms of the wives. She's kind of seen as the one that was almost plain and not really meant to be queen.
Yeah, I mean Jane tends to come last when people poll the wives and sort of say, who's their favorite. Jane never really gets a break, and it's a shame actually. She does get very overlooked. She is treated as a bit of a plain Jane figure. I think she suffers from the comparison with Anne Boleyn. Partly people who love Anne Boleyn hate Jane. But I think in general there's just a sense that she's quite boring. And none of this is true. She's a really interesting figure.
And you often see this when referring to the sixth wife of Henry VIII, is that Jane is referred to as plain, boring, and obedient. And while she was obedient in the sense that she did what she had to survive, she's not plain or boring or even dumb, as some people call her. She was actually quite smart and cautious, and sometimes even perhaps a little bit cunning, as you have said previously. And despite her having died, as a result of her traumatic childbirth, which I feel so sorry for, people don't actually believe that she was important. And she wasn't really somebody who had an impact on history, despite giving Henry his long-awaited son. So
Yeah.
what do you think the reason is she's so overlooked? Is that because, as you say, people would tend to like Anne Boleyn more, or they just don't believe that she was somebody who held much importance?
I think there's a number of factors. We're quite unlucky with Jane that we don't have a huge number of sources about her. So we've got a handful of letters she wrote, but none of them are personal letters. We haven't even got any contemporary accounts of her recorded speech. So actually her words written down. We're really unlucky because the dispatches of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, are largely missing from Jane's time as queen, which is really unfortunate because he gives us all the gossipy detail about Anne Boleyn, for example. Without Chapuis, we'd be much, much poorer on Anne. And admittedly, he hates Anne and he gives us all the bad details, but at least they're the details. By the time his dispatches have disappeared with Jane, he's already speculated that she's not a virgin and been really rude about her appearance. So I think we would have had some really good gossip in those sources. So that's a real shame. I think she also suffers from the comparison with Anne Boleyn. Again, because we know so much about Anne, Jane does tend to fade into the background. But Jane is the woman who supplanted Anne. And I mean, I think that's worth bearing in mind, that she was a woman who was able to attract Henry to the extent that he married her and that he actually removed and executed Anne Boleyn to do it. So I think, there is more to Jane. Her motto is bound to obey and serve. So she clearly is presenting this submissive figure. But I mean, I would be submissive if I was married to a man who just beheaded his previous wife, to be honest. And there are hints that she's less submissive than people would see at first glance. She does get involved in politics. She certainly speaks out very firmly for Princess Mary. And while that's likely to be partly for personal reasons, it's also quite a good idea to make friends with the likely heir to the throne. So Jane isn't being particularly, it's quite a sensible thing to do. So there are examples of her playing a political role as well. So I think partly we still see Jane through her own propaganda, which is this obedient little wife, which just shows how good she is at it, because there's no way that this woman from rural Wiltshire, the lowest born woman ever to be Queen of England by quite a long way, and there's no way that she could have done what she did without being really steely underneath it all.
And it's interesting that you mentioned her political savvy, because when you hear of Jane, the first thing you hear is died in childbirth and gave birth to a son. Do you think that people just don't believe she had any political influence over England?
Yeah, I mean, she's kind of seen as a walking womb to some point. And it's a shame. And partly she's a life half lived. And I always try and bring that out with Jane, is that had she survived the childbirth, we would have seen so much more of Jane. She almost certainly would have been regent for Edward when he died aged 9. Henry has appointed her regent already in the Act of Succession, the second Act of Succession, should he died while Edward is a minor. So she would have been regent. And I think we would have seen some quite remarkable things. With Edward's birth, I think we would have seen a more confident Jane, a Jane who's able to push more, because Henry can't get rid of the mother of his son. He has to stay married to her because he doesn't want there to be any doubts about the legitimacy of his son. So with Edward's birth, she's entirely safe. So I think it is a shame that we view her as through the lens of her son. And partly that's understandable. I mean, even from a Tudor point of view, she's the most successful of the six wives because she produces the surviving son. If you'd asked Henry VIII who his best wife was, and towards the end of his life, he'd undoubtedly say Jane Seymour, as would almost everyone else in England. She's the wife that he's buried with. She's the wife that he pays for memorial masses for and things like that. But I think, it is a shame that she does get viewed, in the rhyme, she's died. I mean, even in Six, she has sort of the least good song of the six in the musical. And I think we do tend to just think, oh, she died, and then we move on, which is a shame.
The fact that she was somebody who is overlooked in history, like even in the history books, we see very little of Jane like that. She's almost as a footnote or an anecdote in this huge part of Tudor history. You have so much on, say, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn because they were the first two wives. It's considered a rivalry. Here enters Jane. She's probably so frightened because of everything that's happened to her, and yet there's almost no sympathy towards her in what we see in books or any movies or anything like that. Do you think that there's a reason for that? Is there a reason we just don't give Jane any sympathy whatsoever?
It's an interesting one because Jane is often quite severely blamed for the fall of Anne Boleyn in a way that Anne doesn't necessarily get with Catherine of Aragon. And really, Anne and Jane do the same thing. They rise within the Queen's household, they attract the attention of the king, and they persuade him to marry them, or he decides to marry them, depending on your point of view. But in both those cases, of course, the king is already married, so they supplant another queen. So actually, they do the same thing. And Jane gets a lot of hate for taking Henry's affection away from Anne. But actually, she does what Anne Boleyn does, and she probably is basing how she plays it on what Anne has done before. But I think actually to think that Jane had anything to do with Anne Boleyn being beheaded is quite simplistic. I mean, in that actually she doesn't have the power to order Anne Boleyn's execution. That really sits with the king. And also, I mean, would you want to persuade your fiance to behead his wife? Because I really would rather, if I were Jane, that Anne was sent to a nunnery, because then if Jane doesn't supply the longed for male heir, then she'll also end up in a nunnery, which is definitely better than ending up on Tower Green. So I think it is quite unfair the way she's portrayed. And I think we do need to move away from this idea that Jane was pushing for Anne's death, because there's absolutely no evidence at all that she was.
And do you think that Jane was almost as cautious as Anne was when she was in her position? She almost didn't want there to be any attention upon her from Henry because she'd seen how Anne had replaced Catherine. Been a bit of talk about how complicit Anne was in that divorce, of whether she wanted it in the first stages of it. Do you think Jane perhaps was also the same? She didn't want him to leave Anne. She didn't want all the same drama. She was actually trying to get away from it, sorry, and that she was maybe pushed into it at all?
So we can't see inside Jane's head, unfortunately, because we just don't have the sources. But I would imagine she was somewhat flattered and quite keen when the king declared his interest. It certainly moves quite quickly between him and Jane. There are accounts of Anne coming upon Jane sitting on Henry's knee, for example. It's a later account, but it kind of gives you a sense that it's moved quite quickly. There is a sense she might have been willing to be Henry's mistress had Catherine of Aragon's death not happened and then Anne Boleyn's miscarriage. So I suspect she was quite keen. She comes from a much poorer family than Anne's, although ostensibly they're the same rank. They're both the daughters of knights. The Boleyns are much wealthier than the Seymours. Jane's very much on the shelf. Her parents haven't managed to arrange a marriage for her. They've married off her other sisters. They haven't found a husband for Jane. She may well not find a husband. There are sort of suggestions she may not have been particularly ravishingly beautiful. And she's probably in her mid-20s. So I suspect she was quite keen, quite surprised probably, but quite keen when the king declared his interest. And again, I think it shows her ambition, and she is very ambitious. She somewhat throws caution to the wind, and she says, I'm going to go for this. I'm going to marry the king. A little bit like Anne Boleyn does, of course, when Anne Boleyn sort of says, whatever happens, I'm going to marry the king at one stage. It's quite similar with Jane. I think she decides this is a really great future. She's not going to turn it down. She's going to see what happens.
And as you mentioned, she follows in the same steps as Anne Boleyn, her predecessor. She catches the king's eye whilst being a lady in wait. Is it a lady in waiting or maid of honor?
Well, she's a maid of honor, yeah.
A maid of honor to the queen, and she refuses to be his mistress, or to at least consummate the relationship whilst having this affair with him. And it almost seems a little bit less bitter than his relationship to Anne Boleyn, his marriage, because we don't see any of the same fights or anything like that. We have some evidence to say that he did tell her off once or twice, and she does seem to learn not to speak out against him. Can you give us some information into what his relationship with James Seymour was like, and whether it was had the same kind of bitterness as Anne Boleyn, or if it was as sweet as we might believe it to be, considering he calls her his true love.
So Henry's obviously quite smitten with Jane. She does this great scene, as Chapuis relates it, that the king sends a letter and a purse of gold to her before their marriage, and she throws herself on her knees before the messenger and refuses to take them, and basically says, I'm an honourable woman. I'm hoping to make a good marriage, and if the king wants to make a present to me on my wedding day, then I will accept it, but otherwise I cannot take this. It's a really quite a theatrical scene. She's really saying, I'm too pure a woman to be your mistress, and Henry is absolutely smitten, and he says, I'm very pure myself. I will only see you with a chaperone. So he moves her brother and his wife into apartments that he can access easily so that he can see Jane there. So I think Henry is very smitten with Jane. I don't think it's a great love affair. Anne Boleyn is his obsession, the passion of his life, undoubtedly. Jane comes along, he finds her attractive. She's kind of in the right place at the right time. So I don't think it is a grand passion. There are hints that he's kind of getting a bit bored of her quite soon after the wedding. At one stage, he said he sees some attractive women, and he says that, if he'd seen them before he was married, he might not have rushed to the altar quite so quickly. So it's not a grand passion. There are hints that he's unhappy with her during the marriage as well, and her coronation keeps being postponed, ostensibly because of plague. But there is a real sense that it may be that she's not pregnant, of course, because she doesn't become pregnant for quite a long time after the marriage. She marries in June 1536, and she's not pregnant until early 1537. So that's quite a long time for a queen who's promised some sons. So I think it's not a grand passion. It's probably not a grand passion on either side. But Henry must have found her attractive because he could have married anyone he wanted to marry. So, there is attraction, there is some level of love. But I think in general, it's almost posthumous love. When Jane provides his son and dies doing it, she becomes the perfect woman in Henry's eyes. She's a woman that died giving him what he most wanted. So it's quite a retrospective view of Jane.
I was just about to say that I feel like his love for her was based more on the fact that she provided that son. She gave him exactly what he wanted, not the fact that he loves her as a person, as individual. As we've seen with Anne Boleyn, he falls head over heels for her and is obsessed with her. And unfortunately, the thing with Henry is that he will cheat on any of his wives. Even poor Jane mentions that he wouldn't have married as quickly if he had seen the women before her. And I wanted to know, when it does become apparent that he is going to get rid of Anne in favour of Jane, is there any sources, any kind of opinions that are given of how the Seymours feel? Because obviously Jane is probably not going to talk about it quite openly.
Yeah, so her brother Edward is definitely involved in attempts to bring down Anne Boleyn. He facilitates Jane's meetings with the king. He's definitely pushing for the marriage. He's really the only one that we can place really pushing for Jane's queenship. Her brothers Henry and Thomas certainly benefit from her being queen, and Henry seems to have been the brother she's closest to. Although she's also quite close to Thomas, actually. Edward is much older, most likely much older than Jane. They advance in rank. Her brother becomes a baron, later an earl, and eventually, of course, will make himself a duke. So it's a really good match for them. Interestingly, her mother doesn't come to court, so she remains in the countryside. Jane's father is dead before Jane becomes queen, so obviously can't come to court. But there is a scandal that may or may not have involved him in the Seymour family, so he might not have wanted to come to court in any event. But really, Edward Seymour pushes for the marriage.
And you mentioned earlier in regards to when she does marry Henry, she doesn't fall pregnant as quickly as he or perhaps even her family would have wished. You mentioned she doesn't become pregnant for many, many months. Was there a sense of timing in terms of when the king marries, there's a certain the queen will be pregnant in, say, 2 to 3 months? Is there any kind of sense of how quickly Henry wanted her to become pregnant?
I think he wants her to become pregnant immediately, really. He's kind of reached that stage in his life. He doesn't have an heir. Of course, Edward won't grow up with Henry. Henry knows that he's not going to see a son through to adulthood, most likely. So he wants her to become pregnant immediately. The Seymours are a very fecund family, and they have a lot of children, a lot of healthy sons. So every month that goes by will have been a bit of a disaster for Jane, because that is quite a long period. We've got sort of 6 or 7 months where she doesn't fall pregnant. And of course, it can take a while, but you would hope, if you're in Jane's circumstances, that it wouldn't take as long as that. So she must have been growing increasingly worried, because there is a time limit. Anne Boleyn only got 3 years. She got 3 pregnancies to try and produce a son. Henry's biological clock is ticking to some extent. So I think Jane couldn't expect too many years if she didn't fall pregnant. Henry would look to remove her. And he can remove his English wives. We've seen it with Anne Boleyn. They don't have powerful families. So if he wants to get rid of them, he can. It's very, very easy.
And I suppose after having seen Anne Boleyn's downfall, after even though it is believed that she was pregnant during their secret marriage and obviously gave birth to Elizabeth early on into her reign. And the same with Catherine of Aragon, she got pregnant very early on into her marriage with Henry. So it must have been very, very frightening for her. And whilst thankfully she does get pregnant, she sadly does pass away due to complications with childbirth and the insufficient medical care that she received, because obviously it's the Tudor times. There's no epidural. There's no, specialist doctors on hand. There's a belief that Jane had an impromptu C-section, which was meant to explain her tragic death, and it's even shown in some historical shows, such as the Tudors. We see a doctor going over and asking the king who would he like to save, Jane or the baby, which is completely and utter nonsense. What do we know of Jane's cause of death? And does the theory that she died because of an unsanitary and poorly performed C-section hold any validity, or is it just complete and utter nonsense?
Yeah, it's complete and utter nonsense. It's one of those rumors. I mean, it's really because Henry has such a reputation as a monster, because to perform a cesarean section on a living woman in the period would have been just a passport to an agonizing death. You can't survive a cesarean in the 16th century. There's no anesthetic. I mean, you're cutting the woman open, they will die. And the reason we know with certainty Jane didn't have a cesarean is that she didn't die. It took her 12 days to die. And she was well enough to attend some of the events for the christening 3 days after the birth. So she definitely didn't have a cesarean. We can sort of take that off the table. Cesareans are carried out occasionally in the 16th century and earlier, but they're always carried out when the mother has died. So if the mother dies, it will be certified by the people attending her that she's died during the labour, and then they will attempt a cesarean, usually just to try to be able to baptize the child before it dies, because actually surviving a cesarean as a baby in the period is pretty unlikely. So no, she didn't have one, but it is a marker of Henry's reputation. And there is a contemporary ballad that talks about Henry ripping open her two sides to save her baby. So it certainly was a contemporary rumour, but she definitely cannot have had a cesarean because she lives for 12 days. So she survives the birth. So she doesn't die of a sort of direct birth trauma. She most likely dies of an infection picked up either during the birth or even after the birth during examinations. She had a really long labour. She's in labour for more than 2 days and more than 2 nights. It's a really, really long labour. And the problem is doctors don't wash their hands in the Tudor period. People don't wash their hands very often. They don't realise that bacteria causes infections. So she picks up an infection either during or after the birth, and that is clearly what has killed her. So it's childbirth complications, but it's at least in this example, Henry is not guilty.
And I was wondering, because there's so little known as in that's been told to people about pregnancy in Tudor times and childbirth, I was wondering if you could give a little insight into what the last few months of Jane's pregnancy would have looked like and how the preparations for labour would have gone. Because a lot of people understand that it's a lot different to nowadays. There was like a whole lying in that they had to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tudor pregnancy is very ritualized for high status women, particularly queens. So they retire to their chambers a month before the birth is due. So they have to estimate, and they sometimes get it wrong or fudge the dates a bit. So Anne Boleyn only retires to her chamber 2 weeks before Elizabeth is born, for example. But I think she's possibly trying to fudge the dates a bit because Elizabeth was probably conceived before their marriage. So you retire about a month before the birth. You have a big ceremony. You take the sacrament. You're absolved of your sins because, of course, there's a real chance you'll die in childbirth. And women know that. And huge risks of death in childbirth. Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, dies in childbirth. Jane Seymour, of course, dies in childbirth. Catherine Parr will die in childbirth. In fact, of the 5 Tudor queens that give birth, 3 of them die in childbirth, which is quite a shocking figure. So they take the sacrament and they're absolved of their sins. They then enter their chamber, and it's a very feminine world, so they don't have any male attendants in there. So women take on the male offices. The chamber will have a great bed in, and it's hung with tapestries, and all the windows are covered actually as well. They want it to be quite a stuffy room. There is actually one window usually that they're allowed to look out of if they remove a hanging to have a look out of it. But it's very regimented. Ordinances for royal births even stipulate what should be on the cushions. You can't have images that might scare the baby, for example. So you need to be quite sensible with your tapestries and your cushions. Birth itself, of course, is the same for all women. The Queen will leave her great state bed and will give birth on a pallet bed because birth's messy. You're attended by a midwife. We know that the Tudor queens have midwives. They also have doctors in attendance potentially. And also female members of the family would expect to be there. So it's likely that at least one of Jane's sisters might well have attended the birth. And you give birth on this pallet bed and hopefully it all goes well. It's a lot more ritualized for royal women, and they will have more medical attention than other women, which is not necessarily a good thing because, of course, with the hand washing thing, but it is a ritualized thing. They then, of course, the baby is baptized a few days later. The parents don't traditionally attend baptisms in England in the period, but Jane and Henry both sort of see Edward off to his baptism on the 15th of October.
And I wanted to ask, because there's always been this what if Jane had lived? What would have England have looked like if Jane had survived the traumatic experience that she went through? Because let's face it, it was traumatic. We might think that birth is easy now, but God, being in that kind of state must have been absolutely horrific. What do you think Jane's involvement in her son's life might have been like had she lived? We see that both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn are very invested in their daughters, whether that's from a distance, because they obviously are separated from their children. They have to live in their own households, and they do either spend money on their education or clothes. Would Jane have had the same privilege, or would she have had to have taken a bit of a step back because she's obviously not the king, and the king is obviously more concerned about his heir than she would have been?
Yeah, so I think she would have been a fond mother. She wouldn't have lived with Edward, of course, but I would imagine she would visit him just as regularly as Anne Boleyn visited Elizabeth or Catherine visited Mary. Because apart from anything else, I mean, clearly she would have a fondness and want a relationship with her own child, but also, of course, he's the heir to the throne, so it makes sense to befriend him anyway. It is different with boys. So when Edward was 6, he was taken out of the nursery and he was removed from his female attendants and was placed in a male household to learn how to be a king. So Jane would never have as close a relationship with Edward as, say, Anne would have with Elizabeth, due to the fact that he's male, and there is a sense that they restrict the mother's influence to some extent. But I think they would have had a close relationship. She would have been Edward's regent, as I said, and so they would have had a close working relationship when he became king. Obviously, he can't behead his own mother as he did with the Duke of Somerset, his actual regent. So I think, she would have lasted the reign and would have been quite an important influence on Edward during his reign.
I just want to have a closer look at her relationship with her two stepdaughters. You mentioned earlier that she does have a close relationship with Mary, and that she does try to kind of bring the royal children back together. This is obviously before she gives birth to Edward. She tries to get Henry to obviously have a better relationship with Elizabeth and Mary. Do you think that had she lived, that close relationship would have still remained? Or do you think that the threat of having that younger brother who is now the heir might have tainted that relationship a bit? Maybe Mary or Elizabeth would have been a bit, I need to have a bit of a distance now because you are the mother to the heir.
No, I mean, I don't think either Mary or Elizabeth resented Edward. They just accepted that he was a boy. He's younger than them, but he's the boy. He's raised with Elizabeth in his early years, and she clearly understands that he's the most important member of the household. They live in a patriarchal society. They just accept the fact that he's male and he's therefore more important to them. So I don't think it would have affected the relationship. Jane has an incredibly close relationship with Mary. Mary writes to her as her mother. She's very much a second mother to Mary, and actually they are very close. We can see this particularly when Jane dies, in that Mary is Jane's chief mourner, and the chief mourner is your closest female relative. So it's not about status, it's about close relationships. So, female relative is if you're a woman, male relative if you're a man. It's your closest relative of the same sex. Jane has a living mother. She also has living sisters. So the fact that Mary is picked demonstrates how close they are. And it's Mary who pays off Jane's household and makes sure everyone is all right as they disperse after Jane's death. So I think they are very, very close. Jane is also quite close to Elizabeth, and she often gets a bad press actually with Elizabeth, but actually there is evidence of her showing interest. She buys clothes for Elizabeth and she gives Elizabeth little presents. They spend some time together. Elizabeth is a lot younger, But I think Jane doesn't have a problem with Elizabeth being in the royal nursery. Had Jane had a daughter instead of a son, I think the relationship could have been more tricky with Mary and Elizabeth, because Jane's daughter would have been heir to the throne above her older sisters. So that could have been more of a difficult relationship. But I think giving birth to Edward wouldn't have affected Jane's relationship with her stepdaughters.
We just spoke about how she was using her influence as the new queen to bring the royal children back in, even though they were now illegitimate. What else do we know that she did as queen to improve England or improve the royal household or anything like that? What did she try to do in her very short reign?
So she's quite an active queen. I mean, it's often said of her that she's very Catholic and very traditional in her religion. I think, again, that's quite overstated. And I think that's a bit of an attempt to compare her to Anne Boleyn. You know, Anne Boleyn's the Protestant queen, so Jane must be the Catholic. And I think actually both of them fall more towards the centre. There's no real evidence of Jane being particularly Catholic or trying to turn the clock back on the Reformation. But I think she is quite active in religion to some extent. You know, she does speak out on behalf of some religious houses. She does speak out on behalf of the rebels in the Pilgrimage of Grace, for example. She does speak to some ambassadors, we know that. So she's playing something of a diplomatic role abroad, but it's quite variable. Again, we don't have a huge amount of the evidence for it. In her own affairs, she's very active. So as queen, she's one of the biggest landowners in the country, and she's very active in her land holdings and very keen to increase the queen's revenues and to make sure that she can pay for her own household. It's notable that Jane doesn't have any debts when she dies, whereas Anne Boleyn does. But really with Jane, she is hampered. She's only queen for about 18 months. So she is a bit hampered with what she can do. She doesn't really have the time to show us what she could have done. And a lot of her time, she's probably quite scared because she hasn't produced Henry's son. So I think, again, she's full of promise, but we don't quite see what she could have done, unfortunately.
It's such a shame because I feel like she would have tried her utmost to use her influence and power as queen for the greater good. She wouldn't have done anything bad. She would have just tried to make the peace. And obviously there was a lot of political unrest and religious unrest at that time because Henry had broken from the church. So obviously she had to both keep quiet and then work from the background. So it's quite interesting that she actually does a lot in that short reign. And not a lot of people realize this, but she was quite close with Catherine of Aragon because they have sort of the same religious beliefs. Do you think that perhaps helped her a little bit? She saw how Catherine was with Henry, that maybe helped her with dealing with Henry in her own way?
Yeah, so we know she served in Catherine of Aragon's household. She definitely did. That's basically all we know about it, unfortunately. She possibly wasn't there very long and then transfers to Anne Boleyn. So it's kind of hard to judge. She's very fond of Mary, which suggests a sympathy for Catherine of Aragon. She certainly will have observed Catherine of Aragon during her time with her. And she probably does model herself more on Catherine of Aragon than Anne Boleyn. Catherine, of course, doesn't lose her head, whereas Anne does. So being more demure, being more quiet, being less outspoken isn't necessarily a bad thing to be. So I think you can see the model in Catherine that Jane then follows.
And I think that brings us to the final question I have, which I'm quite interested about because I don't specifically know all of the details, so I'm quite interested. After Jane's death, obviously, Henry is quite upset. He's just lost the mother of his newborn son, the woman who finally gave him what he wanted after all these years. He's upset. Probably the whole of the court is upset, probably even all of England, because for all they know, she was almost a perfect queen. She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't, I'm doing air quotes here, but bad as Anne Boleyn. Obviously, there was a lot of people pitted against her. What was Henry's initial reaction that we know of to her death? And how soon does he make the arrangements for her funeral or choose that he wants to be buried with her? Because he does die 10 years after her death. So that is quite a lot of time later. And he does have many wives after her. He has 3 wives, none of which give him any children. Does he choose straight after her death to be buried with her? Or is it more of a, I'm going to wait to see how long I last, to see if I get any more sons, and then I'll decide who I'd be buried with?
Yeah, great question. So, I think he's quite shocked by her death. He doesn't have another candidate lined up, for example. And I don't think he was expecting her to die. He'd obviously seen her in the days after the birth when she seemed to be doing okay. So he does seem to have been quite shocked. He talks about leaving Hampton Court where she's dying before she dies and says, if she amends, he'll go, and if and she doesn't, he still will go because he can't find in his heart to tarry. And that's obviously a bit of a paraphrase, but so I think he is very shocked and very upset by her death. I mean, I think there are limits to his upset in that within a few weeks, there are feelers going out around the royal courts of Europe to try and find him another bride. So I think, I mean, I don't think he's devastated by her death, but certainly he is upset and he does seclude himself away for a little bit. He said he will always have had the plan to be buried with her, and we can see this because she's buried at Windsor. So she dies at Hampton Court. You'd sort of expect her to maybe go to Westminster Abbey, which is the traditional burial ground of the kings and queens. But Henry has always wanted to be buried at Windsor, where his grandfather Edward IV is buried. It's important to him. So he has Jane taken to Windsor, and that's the decision taken as soon as she dies. So he clearly was always planning to be buried with her. And of course, that doesn't mean that he won't have room for another wife. So, Catherine Parr, for example, probably could have been buried at Windsor if she'd wanted to be. His other brides, not really, because they all either get annulled or beheaded. But Jane and Catherine Parr are really the only two that could have been buried with Henry. But certainly he always wanted to be buried with her, and she's included in his plans for a grand tomb. He wanted a very impressive monument at Windsor. He had a life-size equestrian statue of him. I think there were some statues of Jane planned as well. Obviously none of it happened, but she was very much included in his scheme for memorialization. I think even though he survives almost a decade, he still thinks about Jane. She's mentioned when he orders prayers for her soul, for example. He does think about Jane. In many respects, of course, until he marries Catherine Parr, she's his only legitimate wife, as far as he's concerned. We look at Henry and say he married 6 times, but actually he would probably argue he'd only married twice. Although actually he does forget to annul the marriage to Catherine Howard, so technically that one remains valid. But really, I mean, he doesn't have a huge number of options for wives to be buried with. Jane really is the only one he could be buried with when he dies, but he always has planned that will happen.
Suppose it would have been quite funny for him to choose to be buried next to Catherine of Aragon, the very first wife that he chooses to set aside. He says, "Nope, you slept with my brother. Our marriage wasn't valid. You only gave me a daughter. But when I die, I'm gonna sleep next to you," basically.
I think people would have thought he'd gone mad if he said that, given all the history. I mean, even Mary didn't attempt to bury her parents together.
I know that just would have been so funny. That would have been so funny if he'd chosen to do that.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, it's when you look at it, there aren't actually that many options anyway. It's conventional to be buried with your spouse. And actually, there's quite a lot of his wives he can't really be buried with. I mean, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, for example, that he can't really be buried with them, can he?
Well, he hasn't given them a proper burial, has he? He's just shoved.
No, exactly.
It's said that he shoved Anne into a chest, yes, and then just was like, "There you go."
Yeah, so, I mean, he'd have to go and identify them, of course, because I'm not sure they're even that well marked, really.
He would just have to go over to the chest and just open it and be like, "Okay, so that's the wife that I killed nearly over a decade ago. I don't like her. I said she cheated on me. She probably didn't, but I'm going to be buried with her anyway."
Yeah, and then he discovered he'd accidentally got Lady Rochford instead.
Oh God, yeah, I'll be buried next to her. I mean, before I end, I just wanted to say you're bringing out a book on Jane Seymour. Is there anything that you think will surprise your readers in terms of something that they didn't know about Jane, or something that we believe to be truth but is actually false?
I think the whole book will surprise them. So obviously I wrote a biography of Jane years ago, and I'm now writing an academic study, so it'll be quite dry and quite in depth, but it's changed my view of Jane considerably. And there's a lot of information on her that nobody's ever seen. I mean, she's a businesswoman. She's very hard-nosed when it comes to her business dealings, for example, which I think will surprise people. Much more hard-nosed than Anne Boleyn, actually. If you go to Anne Boleyn and say, "Well, I've had this lease from Catherine of Aragon, and I paid her £10 and now it's lapsed," Anne Boleyn will often say, "Oh, we'll have another lease." Jane Seymour will generally say, "Oh dear, that's a shame. I'll have another £10, please." So she is quite a hard-nosed businesswoman. I'm hoping that people will be surprised by the Jane that I'm presenting. It's involved a lot of kind of digging through some quite dense legal documents and things like that. So it's not going to necessarily be a page turner, but I'm hoping it will bring out the real Jane and will tell us what Jane was actually like, because I think we do still buy into the myth about her quite a bit. I'm very excited by the chance to kind of to really, really look in depth at Jane, because nobody has before in any depth, and she's fascinating. And she does deserve more attention than she gets. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, she's the most important Queen England has ever had. I think she probably isn't, mainly because she doesn't get enough time to do it. But I think I'd like people to come away from the book to see another side to Jane. She's not always likable. Sometimes she does things where you think, oh, I wouldn't have done that, Jane. But she's very human. And you can get a real sense of this woman who's kind of thrust into this position that she's in no way trained to do. And she does quite a good job at it.
I think that is a beautiful way of putting it, that we forget that these queens were human. They were just almost ordinary women in a sense, that they were just trying to survive in a very patriarchal world. So I want to thank you so, so much, Elizabeth, for joining me today, for talking about Jane. And hopefully sometime next year, our readers will be able, or our listeners will be able to listen and read to your book.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. This is the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII signing off. Have a lovely day.